The jungle mist clung to the Driniamore River Valley like a shroud on the morning of July 10, 1944. Captain Joseph Zimmerman stood in the forward observation post of the 127th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Battalion, studying the tree line across the muddy water with field glasses that revealed nothing but shadow and silence. Behind him, spread across a 3-mile defensive arc in the fetid lowlands of Dutch New Guinea, 1,200 American soldiers waited in positions they had spent 2 weeks preparing. Intelligence reports confirmed what the silence already suggested. Nearly 3,000 Japanese troops from the 18th Army were moving through the jungle, attempting to envelope the American position from 3 sides. Every tactical manual Zimmerman had studied at Fort Benning said the same thing. When facing encirclement by a force more than twice your size, you consolidate, you withdraw to better ground, you call for immediate reinforcement. But Lieutenant Colonel Archibald McKechnie, commanding the battalion, had made a decision that contradicted every orthodox principle of defensive warfare. He ordered his men to hold their extended positions. Let the Japanese complete their encirclement. Let them commit their forces to an attack against what appeared to be an isolated, vulnerable American battalion. The decision seemed like tactical madness to staff officers studying maps at General Hall's headquarters 15 miles to the rear. But McKechnie understood something those officers didn't. The terrain, the weather, and the specific capabilities of his infantry battalion had transformed this apparent trap into the most sophisticated killing ground the American Army had yet constructed in the Pacific War. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Name. During the monsoon season, it became a churning torrent that could sweep away men and equipment without warning. But in mid-July, it had subsided to a sluggish, waist-deep stream, its banks choked with kunai grass and secondary jungle growth that limited visibility to 30 yards in any direction. The Japanese 18th Army, under Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi, had been retreating westward along the New Guinea coast for 3 months, pursued relentlessly by American and Australian forces. What remained of Adachi's command, once numbering over 100,000 men, had been reduced through combat, disease, and starvation to approximately 35,000 effectives, scattered across 200 miles of some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. The Japanese strategy, as American intelligence had pieced together from intercepted radio traffic and interrogated prisoners, was born of desperation masked as offensive action. Adachi planned to concentrate his remaining strength for a surprise attack against the American airfield at Itape, 20 miles to the east. If successful, the assault would disrupt Allied air operations, potentially allow for Japanese reinforcement by sea, and restore some measure of tactical initiative to a force that had been reduced to a starving, disease-ridden remnant. The plan required Japanese forces to cross the Driniamore River, eliminate the American covering force, and advance rapidly on Itape before reinforcements could arrive. It was, in the assessment of Adachi's own staff officers, a plan with perhaps a 20% chance of success. But 20% was better than the certain annihilation that awaited them if they continued their retreat without food, medicine, or hope. The 127th Infantry Regiment had been assigned to defend the west bank of the Driniamore as part of the 32nd Division's covering force. The regiment's 3rd Battalion drew the southern sector, a position that military cartographers described as defensible but exposed. The terrain offered advantages and liabilities in equal measure. The kunai grass provided concealment for defensive positions, but it also allowed attacking forces to approach within grenade range before being detected. The river itself was an obstacle, but one that determined infantry could wade across at dozens of points along the battalion's front. McKechnie had studied these factors with the methodical attention of an engineer examining a bridge under load. The lieutenant colonel was a Naval Academy graduate who had transferred to the Army in 1928, bringing with him a mathematical approach to tactical problems that emphasized calculation over instinct. His solution to the defensive challenge was counterintuitive but precisely reasoned. Rather than concentrating his forces into a compact, mutually supporting perimeter, he deliberately extended his line to create gaps that would channel attacking Japanese units into predetermined corridors. Each gap was covered by interlocking fields of machine gun fire, pre-registered mortar concentrations, and artillery support from the 129th Field Artillery Battalion positioned 3 miles to the rear. The defensive system McKechnie designed relied on a concept that was just beginning to gain acceptance in American tactical doctrine, the killing zone. Unlike traditional defensive positions that attempted to stop attacking forces at the forward edge of the battle area, McKechnie's system was designed to allow enemy penetration into carefully prepared areas where American firepower could be applied with maximum efficiency. The Japanese would not be stopped at the river. They would be allowed to cross, to advance through the gaps in the American line, and then be systematically destroyed by fires directed from positions they couldn't see and couldn't effectively engage. Private First Class Daniel McCarthy occupied a foxhole on the battalion's southern flank, dug into the base of a massive hardwood tree, whose roots provided natural overhead cover. The 21-year-old rifleman from Philadelphia had arrived in New Guinea 6 weeks earlier as a replacement, still carrying the soft appearance of stateside training camps. The jungle had already begun its transformation. His uniform, once olive drab, had faded to a mottled grey-green. His face, gaunt from weight loss and the chronic low-grade fevers that afflicted every soldier in the theatre, had acquired the hollow-eyed look of men who had learned that survival required constant vigilance. McCarthy's position had been selected with care that reflected McKechnie's systematic approach to defensive preparation. The foxhole commanded a clear field of fire across 80 yards of kunai grass that led down to the river's edge. To his left, 30 yards distant, Sergeant William Bradford's heavy machine gun team occupied a position dug into the reverse slope of a small rise, invisible to anyone approaching from the east, but perfectly sighted to deliver enfilading fire across McCarthy's sector. To his right, another rifle position maintained visual contact through the undergrowth, creating a chain of mutually supporting positions that extended along the entire battalion front. The soldiers had spent 14 days improving these positions, digging deeper, constructing overhead cover from logs and sandbags, clearing fields of fire while maintaining natural concealment. They had rehearsed their fire plans during daylight, memorizing the location of every tree, every fold in the ground, every piece of terrain that might provide cover to attacking forces. At night, they conducted listening post operations, sending 2-man teams across the river to gather intelligence on Japanese movements and familiarize themselves with the approaches an attacking force would use. This preparation reflected a fundamental shift in American tactical thinking that was remote, occurring throughout the Pacific Theater in mid-1944. The lessons of Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and New Guinea had been absorbed, analyzed, and incorporated into doctrine that emphasized firepower over maneuver, preparation over improvisation. The American soldier of 1944 was better trained, better equipped, and infinitely more confident than the Green troops who had faced Japanese forces in the dark early days of the war. The weapons that McCarthy and his fellow infantrymen carried reflected this evolution. The M1 Garand rifle, with its 8-round en-bloc clip and semi-automatic action, gave American riflemen a decisive advantage in sustained fire over Japanese soldiers still armed with bolt-action Arisaka rifles. The difference was not merely mechanical. It represented a philosophical divergence in how each army conceptualized infantry combat. Japanese doctrine emphasized accuracy and ammunition conservation, reflecting an industrial base that struggled to maintain adequate supplies of small arms ammunition. American doctrine emphasized volume of fire, confident that the vast industrial capacity of the United States could supply whatever quantities of ammunition were required. Sergeant Bradford's machine gun position embodied this American approach to firepower. The M1919A6 Browning machine gun was an air-cooled weapon capable of firing 550 rounds per minute with a maximum effective range of 1,500 yards. Unlike the water-cooled M1917 that had served at Guadalcanal, this lighter version could be moved rapidly to engage targets of opportunity. Bradford's crew had been trained to a standard that emphasized conservation during defensive operations. 6 to 9 round bursts, shifting aim point between bursts, maintaining barrel discipline to prevent overheating. But they also knew that when the situation demanded it, the Browning could sustain fire at rates that would shred attacking infantry before they could close to effective assault range. The supporting arms available to McKechnie's battalion represented another decisive advantage that the Japanese could not match. The 129th Field Artillery Battalion had emplaced 12 M2A1105 5mm howitzers in positions carefully surveyed and registered on targets throughout the battalion's defensive sector. These weapons could deliver high-explosive, white phosphorus, or proximity-fused shells with accuracy measured in yards, not hundreds of yards. Forward observers attached to each rifle company maintained constant radio communication with the gun batteries, able to call for fire missions that would place shells on target within 3 minutes of identification. The Japanese forces moving through the jungle toward the Drinia Moor possessed none of these advantages. Lieutenant General Adachi's artillery support consisted of a handful of mountain guns and infantry mortars, their effectiveness limited by ammunition shortages that restricted each piece to perhaps 20 rounds for the entire operation. Japanese radio communications had deteriorated to the point where coordination between units was conducted primarily by runner, a system that worked adequately in static defensive positions but proved catastrophically inadequate for offensive operations, requiring precise timing and mutual support. More critically, the Japanese forces approaching the American positions were physically depleted in ways that American intelligence had not fully appreciated. Chronic malnutrition had reduced the average Japanese soldier's body weight by 30 to 40 pounds. Malaria, dengue fever, and dysentery affected an estimated 60% of frontline troops. Many soldiers were surviving on less than 1,000 calories per day, subsisting on foraged roots, insects, and the occasional supply drop that managed to evade Allied air interdiction. These men were still dangerous. They retained their tactical training, their unit cohesion, and their willingness to die in attack. But they lacked the physical stamina required for the kind of sustained offensive operations that Adachi's plan demanded. As the afternoon light began to fade on July 10th, the first confirmed reports of Japanese movement reached battalion headquarters. Native scouts working with American intelligence teams had observed large formations moving westward through the jungle, converging on crossing points along the Drinia Moor. Radio intercepts suggested that the Japanese planned to attack in multiple waves, with the first assault scheduled for the following night. The intelligence was sufficiently detailed that McKechnie could predict with reasonable accuracy where the main Japanese effort would occur and how forces would be committed. The lieutenant colonel issued his final orders to company commanders in a meeting held in the battalion command post, a reinforced bunker dug into the hillside 200 yards behind the forward positions. His instructions were precise and left no room for ambiguity. Companies would hold their positions regardless of penetration. No withdrawal without explicit orders. Forward observers would remain in position even if bypassed by Japanese forces, continuing to call artillery fire on targets behind the American line. Machine gun crews would engage targets according to predetermined fire plans, not react to the most immediate threat. The goal was not to stop the Japanese at the river line. The goal was to destroy them after they had committed to their attack, when they would be most vulnerable to American firepower and least able to maneuver or withdraw. Captain Zimmerman returned to his company positions and briefed his platoon leaders with the same clinical precision. The Japanese would cross the river in force. They would advance through the gaps between positions. American soldiers would hold fire until targets entered the designated killing zones, then engage with overwhelming firepower. No individual heroics, no breaking of fire discipline. The battle would be won or lost based on adherence to the plan, not individual initiative. Private McCarthy listened to his squad leader relay these instructions with the particular attention that soldiers develop when they understand their survival depends on following orders precisely. The young private had learned enough about combat in his brief time in New Guinea to recognize that this battle would be different from the sporadic contact and ambush actions that had characterized the regiment's operations over the previous month. This would be a set-piece engagement, the kind of battle that was won by preparation and firepower, not courage or luck. As darkness settled over the Driniumor Valley on the evening of July 10th, the soldiers of the 3rd Battalion completed their final preparations. Ammunition was checked and rechecked. Grenades were placed within easy reach. Fields of fire were memorized one last time. The forward listening posts reported increasing sounds of movement from across the river, the unmistakable noise of large numbers of men attempting to move through dense jungle with tactical discipline. The Japanese were coming, and they were coming in strength. McKechnie stood in the battalion operations center, studying the map that showed his defensive positions overlaid with the predicted Japanese axes of advance. The mathematics of the situation were clear. If the Japanese attacked with 3,000 men against his 1,200, and if they achieved surprise or managed to concentrate their forces effectively, they could overwhelm his extended positions through sheer weight of numbers. But if his defensive plan worked as designed, if his soldiers maintained fire discipline and executed according to their training, the attacking Japanese forces would walk into a trap from which there would be no escape. The first reports of contact came at 02:30 on the Raise the Comparation, morning of July 11th. Japanese forces had begun crossing the Driniumor at multiple points along the battalion front, wading through the chest-deep water in columns that stretched back into the jungle darkness. American listening posts, positioned on the east bank, reported estimated strengths and directions of movement before withdrawing to their primary positions. The information was relayed to artillery fire direction centers, where gun crews stood ready at their weapons. McKechnie issued the order to commence fire at 0300. The night erupted as 12 105mm howitzers fired in unison, sending high explosive shells arcing over the jungle to detonate among the Japanese assembly areas east of the river. The barrage was precisely calculated. 3 minutes of intensive fire designed not to destroy the attacking force, but to disrupt their timing and force them to deploy prematurely. As the artillery fire lifted, the Japanese response confirmed that Adachi had committed major forces to the assault. The distinctive crack of Japanese rifle fire began to echo across the valley, punctuated by the heavier reports of machine guns and the crump of knee mortars. Green signal flares rose into the sky, their eerie illumination revealing glimpses of soldiers moving through the kunai grass toward American positions. The assault had begun, and the Japanese were advancing with the grim determination of men who understood this might be their last offensive operation of the war. Sergeant Bradford's machine gun crew waited in their position, watching through the darkness as muzzle flashes revealed the approximate location of the advancing Japanese forces. Bradford had his hand raised, signaling his gunner to hold fire. The predetermined engagement range was 60 yards. The Japanese were at 100, then 80, then closing rapidly through the grass. At 65 yards, Bradford dropped his hand. The Browning erupted with a sound like tearing canvas, sending red tracer rounds cutting through the night in flat trajectories that found their targets with mechanical precision. The effect on the advancing Japanese was immediate and devastating. The machine gun's enfilading fire cut across the front of the assault formation, each burst striking multiple targets as soldiers bunched together while moving through the restricted avenues of approach that McKechnie's defensive plan had created. Men fell in clusters, their momentum carrying them forward even as wounds proved mortal. The Japanese infantry, trained to close rapidly with defending forces to negate firepower advantages, found themselves caught in the open, unable to advance and unwilling to retreat. Along the entire battalion front, the pattern repeated with variations. American riflemen held their fire until Japanese soldiers appeared at ranges where even a mediocre marksman could hit a man-sized target. Then the M1 Garands began their work, each rifle capable of firing aimed shots as fast as the soldier could acquire targets. The semi-automatic action that American doctrine emphasized proved its value in these opening moments of contact, where a bolt-action rifle required a soldier to break his sight picture, work the action, and reacquire the target between shots. The Garand allowed continuous engagement without interruption. Private McCarthy fired his first shots of the battle at a Japanese soldier who appeared 30 yards from his position, emerging from the kunai grass with his rifle at port arms. McCarthy's first round struck the soldier in the chest. His second hit another target to the left. His third, fourth, and fifth rounds found additional targets as the assault wave attempted to cross the killing zone. When his 8-round clip ejected with its distinctive ping, McCarthy reloaded smoothly, muscle memory taking over as his conscious mind struggled to process what he was witnessing. The Japanese forces, despite taking horrific casualties in the initial contact, did not break or withdraw. This was the fundamental reality that separated Pacific warfare from combat in other theaters. Japanese soldiers, indoctrinated with Bushido values that considered surrender the ultimate dishonor, continued to attack even when tactical logic dictated withdrawal. They advanced over the bodies of their dead comrades, seeking to close the distance where bayonets and grenades might succeed where rifle fire had failed. This determination to continue attacking into overwhelming firepower was exactly what McKechnie's defensive plan had anticipated and prepared to exploit. As Japanese forces penetrated through the gaps between American positions, they entered areas where pre-registered artillery and mortar concentrations could be employed without risk to friendly troops. Forward observers, speaking calmly into their radio handsets, called for fire missions that brought high-explosive shells crashing down on Japanese soldiers who thought they had successfully infiltrated the American defensive line. The battle's first phase continued through the pre-dawn darkness, a chaotic symphony of violence illuminated by muzzle flashes, tracer rounds, and the brief hellish glare of artillery bursts. By the time the first grey light of dawn began filtering through the jungle canopy at 05:30, the tactical situation had evolved into precisely the circumstance that would define the next 4 days of fighting. The Japanese had achieved penetration at multiple points along the American line, but rather than exploiting these penetrations to roll up defensive positions or advance toward objectives in the rear, Japanese forces found themselves trapped in compartments where American firepower could be applied with devastating efficiency. The mathematics of the engagement were beginning to tell a story that would only become clear in the aftermath. But even in these early hours, the soldiers of the 3rd Battalion were learning a fundamental lesson about modern warfare. Superior numbers meant nothing against superior preparation. Courage was not a match for firepower. And in the jungle warfare of the Pacific, the side that controlled the terrain and could mass fires at decisive points would prevail, regardless of the enemy's determination or tactical skill. The morning of July 11th revealed the true scale of the Japanese commitment and the effectiveness of McKechnie's defensive scheme. As visibility improved with the rising sun, American observers could see bodies scattered across the approaches to their positions, lying in patterns that told the story of each failed assault. But the Japanese showed no signs of abandoning their offensive. If anything, the daylight revealed that Adachi had committed even more forces than intelligence estimates had predicted. Captain Zimmerman moved through his company positions, assessing ammunition expenditure and redistributing supplies to ensure each position maintained adequate stocks for sustained operations. The soldiers, exhausted from 6 hours of continuous combat, showed the strain in their hollow eyes and trembling hands. But they had held. Not a single American position had been overrun, and the defensive line remained intact despite multiple penetrations that had been systematically eliminated through coordinated fires. The Japanese tactical response to their initial failures demonstrated both the strengths and fatal weaknesses of their military doctrine. Rather than withdrawing to reassess and develop new approaches, Japanese commanders committed additional forces to reinforce the attacks that had already failed. This reflected the offensive-minded spirit that permeated Imperial Army training, but it also revealed a dangerous inflexibility when confronting defensive systems specifically designed to exploit such predictable responses. Lieutenant Takeshi Nakamura led the remnants of his company through the jungle east of the Kasparos, Driniomore, attempting to regroup after the disastrous night assault. Of the 130 men who had crossed the river with him, fewer than 40 remained effective. The rest were dead, wounded, or separated in the darkness and confusion of combat. Nakamura was a veteran officer who had survived campaigns in China and the Philippines, but what he had encountered during the night assault defied his understanding of American fighting capabilities. The defensive fire had been too accurate, too sustained, too well coordinated to be the product of frightened soldiers firing blindly into the darkness. Every gap in the American line that appeared to offer a route of advance had proven to be a carefully designed trap. Machine gun fire came from unexpected directions, catching his men in deadly crossfires. Artillery shells fell with precision that suggested the Americans had pre-planned every target, requiring only seconds to bring devastating fires on any concentration of Japanese troops. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. What Nakamura could not know was that he was confronting the cumulative result of 3 years of American tactical evolution in the Pacific. The lessons of every engagement from Guadalcanal forward had been systematically analyzed, incorporated into training programs, and disseminated throughout the army. The soldiers he faced were not the green, uncertain troops that had first encountered Japanese forces in 1942. They were professionals who had been trained to fight as integrated teams, maximizing the capabilities of their weapons while minimizing exposure to enemy fire. The Japanese plan for the second day's operations called for a coordinated assault from 3 directions simultaneously, attempting to overwhelm the American positions through attacks that would prevent mutual support between defending units. Major General Naoki Miyake, commanding the Japanese forces in this sector, had approximately 2,500 effective soldiers remaining from his original force of 3,000. He committed them all to attacks scheduled to begin at 1400 hours, hoping that daylight operations would allow for better coordination than the chaotic night battles. McKechnie received intelligence of the planned assault through radio intercepts decoded by American cryptographers working at higher headquarters. The information provided him with precise timing and approximate locations of the Japanese assembly areas. He used this intelligence to refine his defensive fires, coordinating with artillery and air support to strike Japanese forces before they could launch their attacks. At 13:30, 30 minutes before the scheduled Japanese assault, American artillery opened fire on the assembly areas. The barrage was unlike anything the Americans had yet delivered. 72 rounds per gun, fired over a 20-minute period, saturated an area of approximately 2 square miles with high explosive and white phosphorus shells. The white phosphorus was particularly effective in the jungle environment, igniting the dry kunai grass and creating walls of flame that forced Japanese soldiers to abandon their covered positions. Those who fled the flames ran directly into concentrations of high explosive shells that detonated above ground, sending lethal fragments through the jungle canopy. When the artillery fire lifted at 13:50, American forward observers reported that the Japanese assembly areas had been devastated. But incredibly, the attacks proceeded anyway. Japanese officers, following orders that could not be changed without breaking radio silence, led their surviving soldiers forward into assaults that had already been compromised by the preliminary bombardment. The discipline this required was remarkable, but it also demonstrated the fatal rigidity that characterized Japanese tactical thinking when confronted with situations their doctrine had not anticipated. Private McCarthy watched the second day's assault develop with a growing sense of unreality. He had fired over 120 rounds since the battle began, more than he had expended during all his training. His shoulder ached from the Garan's recoil, his hands were black with powder residue, and his ears rang from the constant noise of battle. Yet Japanese soldiers continued to advance, continued to attack positions that had already proven impregnable to their tactics. The M1 Garand in McCarthy's hands represented a decisive technological advantage that Japanese planners had failed to adequately account for. The Arisaka Type 99 rifle that equipped Japanese infantry was an excellent bolt-action weapon, accurate and reliable, but it required a trained soldier approximately 4 seconds to work the bolt, eject the spent cartridge, chamber a fresh round, and reacquire his target. In those 4 seconds, an American soldier with a Garand could fire 4 aimed shots. Multiply this advantage across hundreds of riflemen engaged simultaneously, and the difference became overwhelming. Sergeant Bradford's machine gun position became the focal point of a sustained Japanese assault that afternoon. A reinforced company of approximately 80 Japanese soldiers, led by officers wielding samurai swords, emerged from the jungle in a coordinated rush designed to overwhelm his position through sheer determination. Bradford's crew responded with textbook precision. The gunner traversed smoothly, engaging targets from left to right in 6-round bursts that dropped attackers in clusters. The assistant gunner fed ammunition belts smoothly, ensuring no interruption in fire. Bradford himself called corrections and identified priority targets, maintaining the disciplined fire that doctrine emphasized over panic shooting. The assault lasted less than 3 minutes. When it ended, 72 Japanese soldiers lay dead or dying in front of Bradford's position. The machine gun crew had fired approximately 450 rounds, achieving a kill ratio that would have seemed impossible to military analysts studying pre-war estimates of combat effectiveness. But the reality of industrial warfare in the Pacific had rendered pre-war assumptions obsolete. Superior firepower, when properly employed by trained soldiers in prepared positions, created kill ratios that exceeded anything in military history. The Japanese forces attempting to advance through the gaps in the American line encountered an even more sophisticated challenge. McKechnie had positioned his reserve company, approximately 120 soldiers, in mobile reaction force positions behind the main line. When Japanese penetrations were detected, these reserves would move to blocking positions and establish new killing zones that trapped enemy forces between the forward defenses and the reserve positions. The Japanese found themselves advancing into pockets from which there was no exit, subjected to fires from multiple directions that eliminated organized resistance within minutes. By nightfall on July 11th, the second day's attacks had failed with even heavier casualties than the first day's operations. American casualty reports indicated 8 killed and 23 wounded, numbers that seemed impossibly low given the intensity of combat. But these figures reflected the fundamental asymmetry of the engagement. American soldiers fought from prepared positions with overhead cover, supported by artillery and air power that Japanese forces could not match. Japanese soldiers attacked across open ground against interlocking fields of fire that had been perfected through weeks of preparation. The night of July 11th into July 12th brought no respite. Japanese forces, apparently convinced that darkness would negate American firepower advantages, launched a series of infiltration attacks designed to penetrate defensive positions and attack from the rear. These tactics had proven effective earlier in the war against less prepared opponents. Against McKechnie's battalion, they resulted in additional casualties without achieving any tactical gain. The infiltration attempts revealed another critical advantage that American forces possessed: superior night vision equipment and illumination capabilities. Artillery units fired star shells that bathed the battlefield in harsh white light, eliminating the darkness that Japanese tactics depended upon. Mortar crews dropped illumination rounds over suspected infiltration routes, creating overlapping zones of visibility that made concealed movement impossible. When Japanese soldiers were detected attempting to infiltrate, they were engaged by rifle fire directed at clearly visible targets, not blind firing into darkness. Corporal James Mitchell manned an outpost position 50 yards forward of the main defensive line, tasked with providing early warning of Japanese movements. The 23-year-old soldier from Oregon had volunteered for this assignment, understanding that outpost duty carried significantly higher risk than positions within the main perimeter. But Mitchell also understood that his position, equipped with a radio and supported by pre-registered artillery fires, represented a critical node in the defensive system. At 02:15 on July 12th, Mitchell detected movement to his front. He whispered into his radio handset, alerting the company command post and requesting illumination. Within 30 seconds, a star shell burst overhead, revealing approximately 30 Japanese soldiers moving in single file toward his position. Mitchell allowed them to approach within 40 yards before engaging with his M1 carbine, a lighter weapon more suitable for close-range combat than the full-sized Garand. His first shots dropped the lead soldiers, creating confusion in the column behind them. The Japanese response was immediate and violent. Rifle fire cracked overhead, forcing Mitchell to take cover in his foxhole. But the outpost had served its purpose. The company command post now had precise location data on a Japanese infiltration attempt. Within 2 minutes, artillery fire began falling on the infiltrators, high explosive shells that detonated with lethal effect among soldiers caught in the open with no cover. Mitchell heard the screams of wounded men mixing with the crack of exploding shells, a sound that would haunt his dreams for decades after the war. The third day of battle, July 12th, saw a subtle shift in Japanese tactics that suggested learning was occurring despite the catastrophic casualties. Rather than launching mass assaults against obvious strong points, Japanese commanders began probing attacks designed to identify weak points in the American defensive system. Small groups of 10 to 20 soldiers would advance cautiously, attempting to draw fire that would reveal American positions. When defenders responded, Japanese observers would note the location and attempt to coordinate artillery or mortar fire against those positions. This more sophisticated approach might have succeeded against less disciplined defenders. American soldiers, trained to hold fire until targets entered predetermined killing zones, refused to be baited into premature engagement. The Japanese probing attacks advanced into empty ground where no defenders were positioned, then found themselves subjected to flanking fires from positions they had not detected. The result was the same as the previous day's operations: Japanese casualties mounting without corresponding American losses. Lieutenant General Adachi, monitoring the battle from his headquarters 15 miles to the west, faced a decision that would define his remaining career and legacy. 3 days of sustained attacks had cost him approximately 1,800 casualties, the majority killed in action. His remaining effective strength was perhaps 1,200 soldiers, many of them wounded or suffering from disease and exhaustion. The original objective of breaking through to Itape had become impossible. Even reaching the American artillery positions behind the forward defensive line seemed beyond his capability. A rational commander, assessing the situation objectively, would have ordered withdrawal. Preserve the remaining force, retreat to more defensible positions, avoid additional casualties in attacks that had no prospect of success. But Adachi was not operating under purely rational constraints. Japanese military culture placed extraordinary emphasis on offensive action and completion of assigned missions. To withdraw without achieving objectives meant admitting failure, accepting dishonor, and potentially facing charges of cowardice from superiors in Tokyo who did not understand the tactical reality on the ground. Adachi ordered a final, all-out assault for the night of July 13th into July 14th. Every remaining soldier would be committed. The attack would focus on a single point in the American line, attempting to achieve breakthrough through concentration of force rather than the dispersed attacks of previous days. It was a desperate gamble by a commander who understood he had no good options remaining. McKechnie received intelligence of the planned assault through the same radio intercepts that had provided warning of previous attacks. But this time, the Japanese were concentrating their remaining strength against a 1,000-yard section of his defensive line, specifically targeting the sector held by Baker Company. The lieutenant colonel faced his own difficult decision. He could reinforce Baker Company, strengthening the threatened sector but potentially weakening other areas. Or he could trust that his defensive system, having worked effectively for 3 days, would continue to function as designed. McKechnie chose to trust his plan and his soldiers. Baker Company received additional artillery support and priority for illumination missions, but no additional infantry reinforcements. The message to Captain Harold Stevens, commanding Baker Company, was characteristically direct: hold your position, execute your fire plan, and inflict maximum casualties on the attacking force. The final Japanese assault began at 01:30 on July 14th with an artillery barrage that represented the expenditure of virtually all remaining Japanese ammunition stocks. Approximately 200 shells fell on Baker Company's positions over a 15-minute period, a bombardment that would have been inconsequential by European theatre standards, but represented a significant effort for the ammunition-starved Japanese forces. The barrage caused 3 American casualties and provided the attacking forces with the psychological boost of supporting fires. At 01:45, approximately 1,000 Japanese soldiers emerged from the jungle in a coordinated assault that represented everything Adachi could still commit to offensive operations. They advanced in multiple waves, officers leading from the front with drawn swords, soldiers fixing bayonets and preparing for close combat. The traditional Banzai cry echoed across the valley, a sound designed to inspire attacking troops and terrify defenders. The Americans responded with professional calm. Baker Company's defensive fires opened simultaneously across the entire threatened sector. Machine guns, rifles, mortars, and artillery created a storm of steel that struck the advancing Japanese with industrial efficiency. The effect was catastrophic. The leading wave, approximately 300 soldiers, was essentially destroyed in the first 2 minutes of contact. Bodies piled up in drifts, where machine gun fire had caught densely packed formations. The second wave advanced, over their dead comrades, closing to within 30 yards of some American positions before being stopped by concentrated fire. Private McCarthy, positioned in Baker Company's southern sector, experienced the assault as a succession of targets appearing in his rifle sights. Fire, shift aim, fire again, reload. Fire. The mechanical repetition created a surreal sense of disconnect between action and consequence. Each trigger press meant death for a Japanese soldier, but the emotional weight of that reality would not register until days or weeks later, when the immediate demands of survival no longer consumed all conscious thought. The climax of the assault came when approximately 200 Japanese soldiers achieved penetration through a narrow gap between two American positions, advancing 50 yards into the defensive system before being detected. This was the moment that McKechnie's entire defensive plan had been designed to exploit. Rather than panic or attempt hasty reinforcement, American commanders calmly executed the planned response to penetration. Artillery fires were shifted to seal off the penetration, preventing additional Japanese forces from following. Machine guns repositioned to deliver flanking fire into the penetration. The reserve company moved to blocking positions that prevented the penetrating force from advancing further or retreating. The 200 Japanese soldiers who had achieved this penetration found themselves trapped in a pocket approximately 100 yards deep and 50 yards wide, subjected to fires from 3 directions with no possibility of withdrawal. They fought with desperate courage, attempting to storm American positions that had clear fields of fire and prepared defenses. Within 30 minutes, organized resistance within the pocket had ceased. American casualties in eliminating this penetration: 2 killed, 7 wounded. Japanese casualties: 198 killed, 2 captured wounded. By 0400, the final Japanese assault had expended itself against defenses that had proven impervious to everything Adachi could commit. The survivors, perhaps 300 soldiers from the original attacking force of 1,000, retreated into the jungle in small groups, abandoning equipment and wounded in their haste to escape the killing ground. Japanese offensive capability in the sector had been effectively destroyed. The morning of July 14th revealed the full scale of the disaster that had befallen the Japanese 18th Army. American patrols moving through the battlefield counted approximately 2,800 Japanese bodies in and around the defensive perimeter. Equipment lay scattered across square miles of jungle: rifles, machine guns, mortars, ammunition, personal effects, all abandoned in the retreat. Medical personnel treating wounded American soldiers discovered Japanese diaries and letters that revealed the physical condition of the attacking forces: chronic malnutrition, untreated diseases, desperation born of months of defeat and privation. The final casualty figures for the 4-day battle told a story that military historians would analyze for decades. American losses: 43 killed, 112 wounded. Japanese losses: approximately 2,800 killed, with several hundred additional wounded who were evacuated or died later from their injuries. The exchange ratio exceeded 65-1, a disparity that seemed impossible until examined against the specific circumstances of the engagement. McKechnie's defensive system had functioned exactly as designed. Japanese forces had been channeled into killing zones where American firepower could be applied with maximum efficiency. Artillery support had disrupted Japanese attacks before they could develop momentum. Machine guns positioned for enfilading fire had created casualties that traditional frontal engagement could never achieve. Most critically, American soldiers had executed their assigned tasks with professional discipline, avoiding the panic or confusion that might have allowed Japanese tactics to succeed. The strategic consequences of the battle extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. General Adachi's offensive capability had been eliminated, forcing Japanese forces in New Guinea into purely defensive operations for the remainder of the war. The Itape airfield remained secure, enabling Allied air operations that would support the continued advance along the New Guinea coast. Most importantly, the battle demonstrated conclusively that American forces had achieved a level of tactical sophistication that rendered Japanese offensive doctrine obsolete. The human cost of this demonstration was borne almost entirely by Japanese soldiers who fought with courage and determination against a defensive system they had no capability to overcome. Many of these soldiers were veterans of earlier campaigns, experienced infantry, whose loss represented an irreplaceable depletion of Japanese military capability. Their deaths were not meaningless sacrifices to abstract strategic objectives, but the inevitable result of a tactical doctrine that emphasized spiritual qualities over material realities. For the American soldiers who fought at the Driniamore River, the victory provided validation of training methods and tactical concepts that had been developed through painful experience in earlier campaigns. They had demonstrated that defensive positions, properly prepared and supported by adequate firepower, could defeat numerically superior attackers, regardless of their determination or fighting spirit. The lesson would be applied in subsequent battles across the Pacific, contributing to the steady erosion of Japanese combat effectiveness that would ultimately lead to surrender. Private McCarthy emerged from his foxhole on the afternoon of July 14th, physically and emotionally exhausted, from 4 days of sustained combat. The young soldier from Philadelphia had fired over 400 rounds, a volume of fire that would have seemed impossible in peacetime training. He had witnessed death on a scale that no 19-year-old should experience, watched men die in waves as they charged against defenses they could not overcome. The memories would remain vivid for the remainder of his life, periodically surfacing in dreams and quiet moments, when his mind wandered back to the jungle valley, where he had learned the true cost of war. Sergeant Bradford supervised the cleaning and maintenance of his machine gun, running patches through the barrel to remove the carbon fouling that accumulated after firing thousands of rounds. The weapon had performed flawlessly throughout the engagement, never jamming or malfunctioning despite sustained use under difficult conditions. Bradford understood that mechanical reliability was only part of the equation. The training that had taught him and his crew to employ the weapon effectively, to maintain fire discipline and select appropriate targets, had proven equally essential to their survival and success. Captain Zimmerman walked through his company positions, speaking quietly with soldiers who were experiencing the aftermath of combat for the first time. The exhaustion, the shakes, the inability to sleep despite overwhelming fatigue, these were all normal responses to abnormal experiences. Zimmerman knew from his own earlier combat that the psychological impact would fade with time, but that certain images and sounds would remain permanently imprinted in memory. The battlefield itself bore witness to the violence of the engagement. Shell craters pockmarked the ground where artillery had struck. Trees were shattered by explosions, their trunks splintered and white against the jungle green. The kunai grass was trampled flat along the approaches where Japanese forces had advanced repeatedly into American defensive fires. And everywhere, scattered across the landscape, lay the evidence of human fragility when exposed to industrial weapons. Lieutenant General Adachi survived the battle, but his military career was effectively ended by the defeat. His surviving forces continued to retreat westward, harassed by Allied air attacks and ground pursuit, diminishing daily through combat losses, disease, and starvation. At the war's end, Adachi would surrender with fewer than 13,000 of the 100,000 soldiers he had commanded at the campaign's beginning. He would later commit suicide while awaiting trial for war crimes, choosing death over dishonor in the final expression of the Bushido Code that had informed his military career. For McKechnie and the 3rd Battalion, the Driniamore River battle became a case study in defensive warfare that would be analyzed and taught at military schools for generations. The fundamental principles demonstrated in those 4 days of combat would inform American defensive doctrine throughout the remainder of the 20th century: preparation over improvisation, firepower over maneuver, coordination over individual heroics. The 1,200 American soldiers who allowed themselves to be encircled by Japanese forces had accomplished something that seemed impossible when examined objectively. They had not merely survived against odds of more than 2 to 1. They had inflicted a defeat so complete, so devastating, that Japanese offensive capability in the sector ceased to exist. They had killed 2,800 enemy soldiers while losing fewer than 50 of their own. And they had done so not through luck or enemy incompetence, but through professional execution of a carefully designed defensive plan. The jungle that had witnessed this transformation in warfare fell silent in the days following the battle. The monsoon rains returned, washing away the physical traces of combat, slowly reclaiming the cleared fields of fire and erasing the scars of artillery. But the lessons learned in that valley would endure, carried forward by the soldiers who survived and incorporated into the institutional knowledge of an army that was learning, with each engagement, how to fight and win in the most hostile environments on Earth. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.